Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Professor Gregory Connor, and we're going to be discussing the research on admixture studies. Hello, Professor Connor. How are you doing?
Oh, great. Thanks so much for having me. I look forward to talking to you. I read your article this morning, so
Which one?
I read your article in Emporia this morning. Yes.
Is it a new
You had an
article?
article that just came out today.
Okay,
It
so
was
it's a new
about,
article, yes, on West Indians.
yes, entrepreneurship in the
Yes,
West
good,
Indian.
good,
Yeah,
good. So
yeah.
it came out this morning. Professor Connor, I have been following your research for some time, and on this show, we're really academic. So it's really good that your expertise is in statistics because we're going to be discussing statistical methods. Professor Connor, you are an economist who also moonlights as a researcher of genetics
Yes.
because of your strong quantitative abilities. What is Spearman G? What is Spearman's G?
Okay, well, let me answer that as an economist, because I think that's a good way for people to understand the concept. Everyone knows the concept of today the stock market was up. You know, you wake up, you come home from work at 5 p.m. and you listen to the news and the announcer says, "Oh, the stock market was up today." And what do they mean the stock market was up? They don't mean every single stock is up. What they mean is there's a general tendency, there's a common score. Most of the stocks across a broad class are up today. Now, you might be someone who has all of your pension in one stock, you know, Acme Incorporated, and you say the stock market isn't up today. My stock is down. That just means you have an idiosyncratic or stock specific difference. Okay. So that's called a factor. That's called a general factor when there's a general tendency. And what Spearman discovered in the early 20th century was that there's that type of feature in cognitive ability. He, you might think that people who are good at geometry aren't good at spelling, okay? And people who are good at algebra aren't good at history. But it turns out the way the brain works, people who are academically talented tend to be talented roughly across the full range. Now, it's not, you know, there's obviously differences, but there tends to be this general factor of intelligence, and that's called Spearman's G. It's essentially identical or almost identical to what people call IQ. People have absorbed the idea of a general factor of intelligence when they say someone has a high IQ. They basically mean that person might be good at history, but also good at spelling, also good at grammar, also good at algebra. So this general cognitive ability. And the interesting thing about it statistically is it's very strong. It's surprisingly strong. Of course, it's not identical. I mean, you could take Albert Einstein, you know, someone who has a very high G score, and you might ask him a question about history. You know, what year, what's the capital of Illinois? And he might say, oh, gee, I don't know. That doesn't push him down. His general intelligence was very high. Okay, similar to someone who isn't really very academically talented and doesn't have strong cognitive ability might know the capitals of all the 50 states, but that's a, you know, a specific knowledge, and Spearman's G is general ability and knowledge. Uh,
Interesting.
yeah, and that's
The
measured with
ability,
statistical techniques.
exactly. The ability to recall information is not a measure of intelligence. So
Well, it's
memory,
part
there is
of,
a yes, there is a correlation between memory and intelligence, but there are people with a good memory who are not highly intelligent. So there's the assumption that if you recall information, you are intelligent. That's not always the case.
correct. That's correct. Now, recall is a substantial component of intelligence, but also analyzing and knowing structures and such. I mean, there's a whole range of abilities. But the interesting thing is they all tend to be correlated, and that's why they talk about a general factor of intelligence. And then you have, of course, an environmental component to tests. So, for instance, if someone's asked, has a test where state capitals is included, people would say, oh, that's not a good measure of the general factor of intelligence because that's quite a specific bit of knowledge. So what you try to avoid when you're measuring the general factor of intelligence is specific bits of knowledge which are specific to what environment you've been raised in. Were you in a household where your parents traveled a lot and were very keen on you knowing all the different states and their capitals? Okay, that would be a very specific feature. Whereas what isn't so specific is the ability to, when given a string of digits, 1, 7, 5, 3, 6, being able to then repeat it, remember it, and then repeat it back to the test giver. Or even more difficult would be, given a string of digits, 1, 3, 5, being able to reverse them and call them back 5, 3, 1. That's quite non-specific. That's quite general. So you give a lot of different tests, and then you all designed to capture what's actually going on inside your brain box and its ability to process, use, and keep information, and isn't so much reliant on your specific upbringing and your specific education.
1, 3, 5, 7, 6. I like digit
Yeah,
span test. Yes, I do.
that's
1, 3,
right.
5, 7,
That's
6.
called digit span, and when you
Yes.
reverse them, that's called reverse digit span. And I'm not a psychometrician, but of course, psychometricians have been working very hard for many decades to try to make these tests as good as they are. They are not perfect, but they try to make them not too dependent upon what particular educational background you have. They'll never do that completely, and we shouldn't pretend there isn't a big environmental component to test scores. There is, but there's also a big physical brain processing component as well.
So
that goes against what we thought in the mid 20th century. People had this idea of what's called the blank slate. I'm sure you've heard of it, Lipton, but maybe some of
please
our
repeat
listeners
it. Explain, elaborate again.
Okay, the blank slate was an idea that developed in the 1920s and was with the rating orthodoxy probably right up through the 1960s or even 1970s, and is still very dominant in polite conversation, even though no one with knowledge of the research findings any longer believes in it. The blank slate was an idea that was very influential in social sciences. It was the idea, it actually comes all the way back from early philosophers like John Locke, the idea that every person is born with an identical brain and has the same ability to do any cognitive task, but only their upbringing and how they're taught affects what they become, whether they become a neuroscientist or become a bathroom attendant, or a truck driver. Okay, that doesn't depend at all on the physical structure of your brain. Your physical brain is a blank slate. They're all identical. It only depends upon how you're brought up and taught. That turns out to be false, but it was a very warm and cuddly model that was very appealing. It's still very socially appealing. It's a shame it isn't true about the world, but it isn't true about the world. The truth about the world is, your ability to process information and remember information and use information cognitively does depend on the genetically produced hardware in your brain. That's the hard truth of reality. Even though the blank slate idea, it's very appealing.
I have read Robert Plomin, and according to Robert Plomin, in his recent books, parents matter because of their genes, and his findings have been replicated since then. The environment matters because the environment was created due to genetic ability. That's why it really matters. There are actually two new studies by European researchers basically contending that genes don't really matter much for social mobility. Sorry, not genes, the environment doesn't really matter much for social mobility.
Yeah, that's a very hard question to answer. I've read Plomin's book, The Blanks. I forget the name now, but I read his bestseller from a few years ago, Blueprint, it was called.
Yes.
And yeah, I think Yeah, the point the point is when you do simple statistical tests carefully run on twin data and related data, okay, basically identical twins and non-identical twins, as well as twins reared apart, both identical and non-identical, and you break out heritability, which is environment, from shared environment, which is whatever is common in the household, and non-shared environment, which is the difference between two siblings, for example, in the same household, perhaps not genetic siblings, or they might be, and you have to adjust for that. What you find is the non-shared environment and the heritability, the genetic component, dominate. But there are some limitations, and I don't want to overstate the case there, but it's clear that the research, starting really in the 70s, showed a shockingly big genetic component. And some people, there are some limitations. One of the limitations, which is quite interesting, is parents not only give you your, cognitive power of your brain, they also give you your tendency to raise your children in a particular way. So some parents, for instance, talk a lot to their infants. And by talking to them, they are improving their vocabulary and their grammar, as well as probably their general ability to use their, cognitive traits. This is actually an environmental component, but it appears in the genetic component. And a lot of the recent studies have highlighted this, that the genetic component actually also includes a hidden quasi-environmental component, which is the tendency for parents to raise their children in a cognitively enriching way. So there are complications in the research findings, but the shocking research finding, which has really affected psychometrics and social sciences more broadly, is that the genetic component of cognitive ability is extremely large. 80% people point. This is across individuals. So just looking across individuals, you find about 80% of the variation in, we'll call them IQ scores, can be explained by genetic factors. Most of this is using twin study designs.
Professor Connor, what is an admixture study?
Okay, admixture studies are a very powerful method of analyzing population groups, which are normally, for instance, Black, white, Asian is a common differentiation, but it can be other population groups, okay? But some group of people who are related genetically, okay? So for instance, Europeans are more closely related genetically to each other, okay? And Africans are more closely related genetically to each other. They have more common, fourth and fifth and sixth and seventh and eighth cousins to each other in their past, okay? So they have more cousin relationships. So they're groups of people who are more genetically related. And of course, for most of human history, those are very clearly divided up categories. Now they're not so clear, okay? So what admixture regression studies do is they're a trick that you can use to identify traits that are common in those groups, okay? So for instance, let's say you want to look at sleep depth, how deep people sleep, okay? It turns out, you might say, oh, well, what turns out Black Americans are lacking in sleep depth relative to white Americans. And you might say, oh, that's because perhaps, hey, maybe it's because of the music they like. They have different tastes in music. Or maybe it's because they live in more urban neighborhoods and the neighborhoods are noisy, okay? Or maybe it's because they're forced into segregated neighborhoods. So you can have a lot of environmental explanations for that, okay? What admixture regression allows you to do is say, no, it isn't, okay? It's 90% due, let's say, to their common cousins. There's a little bit of a difference in their genome, which gives them less sleep depth. Okay, that's called admixture regression. Now, I knew you were going to ask me about this, Lipton, so I brought I hope you'll let me use it, a visual aid, because I want people to understand this. So let me give you a visual aid to just make things um, a little more simple. I've got here a deck of, we'll call them brand new cards, okay? It isn't actually new cards, but let's pretend this is a deck of brand new cards. I'm playing poker with my friends, and I just opened this deck of new cards, okay? And they're not shuffled. That's the key thing, okay? So I open the deck. I say to my friends, let's play poker, okay? All right. And this is a brand new deck of cards, so they're in order. Bottom card is the two of clubs. Top card is the ace of hearts, okay? And they're in order. And I say to my friends, okay, we're going to play poker. I'm going to now mix up the cards. And I take the cards like this, and I cut them in half, right? I randomly cut them in half, and then I put them back together. I say, okay, friends, I've shuffled the cards. Now we can play. My friends would say, forget it. You have not properly shuffled those cards. All you did was cut them in half one time. Okay, that isn't a proper shuffling, right? Because lots of them would still be in the order that the manufacturer gave them in, right? That's a very poor shuffling. That's all random genetic combination does. It only cuts. It does little cuts, tiny little cuts in your mother's and your father's DNA and combines their genomes, okay? It doesn't do what people think it does, which is shuffle them, okay? And we all know what shuffling is. That's when you really mix them, right? That's really mixing the cards. It doesn't do that. It just cuts them in a few places. What that means is you, Lipton Matthews, have big, long chunks of your DNA which are identical to your mother. You also have big, long blocks of your DNA which are identical to your father. And the same for me, okay? And even for my grandfather or grandmother, I could have huge 50 million long blocks of DNA, which are identical to my mother's father or someone, okay? And that property is preserved for hundreds and thousands of generations. It's called linkage disequilibrium. So when we look at DNA, we can tell a whole lot about your ancestry just by looking at the DNA components. Because of course, nowadays, after the Human Genome Project, we know the full structure of the human genome. So we know every single of the 2.9 billion base pairs. We know each one, where it's located, and what is the common value. These individual base pairs have values 0, 1, or 2, and we know all 2.9 billion of them in order, okay? So we can take a human genome and we can say a whole lot about its ancestry very precisely, okay? It's a very precise process. So what this allows us to do, given the example of the sleep depth, is to take a group of African Americans, okay, because they're the ones with the poor sleep depth, and we can say, okay, this individual is African American, but he's actually only 20% African American. So a good example would be like Kamala Harris. Okay, she's an African American, but she's actually only about a quarter African American. Okay, and we could easily get the exact number from her human genome. Now it's a bit tricky, but technically it's been solved. Okay, and then we can compare her to someone who's 100% African American and compare their sleep depth. And if we do this for 50,000 or 60,000 African Americans, what we find is, oh, actually, it isn't the urban neighborhood or the choice of, cultural choice of the music or the TV shows we watch. It isn't that. It's actually something hidden in the African genome. It's something common to these first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh generation African ancestors that leads to the weak sleep depth. So admixture regression allows you to identify and separate out self-identified race-related features like liking rap music, Okay, maybe African Americans prefer rap music. You might think, well, that might interfere with their sleep death. We can separate that from genetically based components. So that's it's a miracle basically of statistical methodology coming out of the Human Genome Project that we can actually separate out what's called biogeographic ancestry based sources of difference from racial identity sources of difference. Now, this is used a lot in medicine. It's caused a whole lot of, especially I should mention, because I talked about African American, because they're genetically quite different from Asians and Europeans, it's been especially useful for them in medical research because they have a lot of commonality in their cousin, in this body of, seventh uh, level cousins. It's been particularly valuable for them in a whole range of medical research, or just over the last 10 or 15 years. So it's really helped medically to understand the particulars of different groups. Another group it's helped is Ashkenazi Jews, who also have quite a bit of genetically based medical issues because they were a very isolated group in Europe, a small isolated group. So that led them to develop some particular genetic issues, in medical genetic issues. Now, where it gets controversial, where it gets controversial is when you use G factor scores as the variable of interest. There's no difference. It could be sleep depth, it could be cancer, it could be diabetes, it could be types of obesity. There's a whole range of traits that are tested via admixture regression, and no one worries about them. But all of a sudden, when you hit G factor scores, it becomes very sensitive for people that, in fact, the well-known IQ difference that we see between Black Americans and European Americans, there's a 15 point, roughly, or 12 to 15 point
Well,
IQ
according to
difference.
a new report, the figure is 9. So when Richard Nisbet and his co-author responded to Charles Murray, they quoted a lower figure around 9, but the gap exists.
Sure.
That's the point. And
Yes.
15 is still used in some cases because there was a UK study that found the gap near to 15. But
Oh,
continue.
yeah, it depends somewhat. Yeah, getting that's why I said 15 or 12. There's a range of estimates, and they also came, it did fall in the 1990s a little bit. That was credited with the civil rights movement and the improvement in education in the American South for African Americans in the American South during the 50s and 60s, and then that carried on. And then you saw a little bit of a decline, but then it flattened. Actually, I think it's more the 80s. I think it ended by about 1991 or
Well, the
92.
Brookings
Charles Murray has some
Institute,
work on
yes,
that.
the Brookings Institute said that the gap narrowed, but there have been criticism. Some argue that there was no secular narrowing of the black-white IQ gap.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, admixture regression doesn't really look so much at the size of the gap, although there has to be a gap for it to have any relevance. So if there's no gap, you can't do admixture regression. There has to be a gap. What you do with admixture regression is if there is a gap in some feature, say it's sleep depth, or it's a particular type of cancer, or it's, as we're talking about, IQ scores, you use that as what's called the dependent variable. That's the variable of interest. And you use my little trick where we can divide up people's ancestry. So you have to have people, it doesn't work if you don't have people have some admixture. That's why it's called admixture regression. You must have people who vary in their proportion of ancestry. And they also must be able to self-identify, because you want to capture the environmental component. So people who self-identify as one group or the other. That's also problematic, but that's important that people have an identification of a group. That's included to just cover the environmental features. And often you also include other environmental variables to pick up other sources of environmental variation, okay? But this allows you to identify the genetic component without really knowing what it is. In other words, we do these tests, we say, oh, look at this. There's a substantial genetic component to the G factor score differences between African Americans and European Americans. There's a substantial genetic component. And then one criticism is, well, what is it? Show it to me. What are the particular base pairs where African Americans have a tendency to have a 0 and European Americans have a tendency to have a 2, or the reverse, okay? In other words, what are the exact base pairs? We don't know that. Keep in mind, there's 2.9 billion, call it 3 billion. There's 3 billion base pairs. We can't identify what the individual ones are. We're using the trick. We're using the trick of the ability to measure biogeographic ancestry to know that there are such base pairs without identifying what they are. So it's a very powerful statistical methodology, which is able to find genetically generated differences across ancestries without knowing exactly what are the base pairs that are generating those differences.
Well, I read your article, Facing Reality, some time ago. We're not going to discuss this issue extensively, but I must add that you cite Gust et al. So this person and the co-authors use statistical inference and a comprehensive micro database of international and regional achievement tests to map academic achievement of youths in 159 countries onto a common measurement scale. So that
Yes.
was the Goose study. There is
Yes.
also the World Bank study, the World
Yes.
Bank Learning Harmonized Outcomes, and both
Yes.
studies confirm Richard Lynn's findings that human capital is lower in Africa. So when Richard Lynn published his findings some years ago, he was criticized, but
Yes.
currently it seems that we're exonerating Lynn because his findings are accurate. Human capital scores in Africa are lower.
Yes. That's what I was trying to do in that article was really there's going on. So you have this admixture regression findings, which are quite powerful statistical findings. But if you try to publish that and your dependent variable, your variable of interest is G factors, it's very hard to get it published. And there's enormous hostile receptions to this research because there's kind of, there's this basic cone of silence. There's this censorship a regime in place, which really prevents this academic research from being published, even though it's pretty clear stuff. It isn't in any way, having had a long career doing empirical research, it's not in any way questionable relative to, the broad other articles in the same issue that you want to get published in. But it's just said, we will not publish anything. And then you have people claiming that, oh, it's pseudo research, it's false, and they give all these ridiculous reasons for preventing admixture regression findings from being published when the variable of interest is G factor scores, okay? And what I'm trying to do in that article is just make people aware that it fits into a whole body of findings, as you mentioned, that cross-national findings are one body of findings. But if you look across a whole range of findings, the admixture regression results are not a surprise. They fit in with a whole range of confirmatory findings using many techniques. I would say the Gust et al. Technique, which you mentioned, where you look across countries and you measure, you look at the ancestry group that's dominant in the country, and then you look at the test scores of the high school students, okay, as they do. I would say that's one of many findings which are kind of coherent with the admixture regression findings. But actually, I'd say it's not, I don't know if you'd agree with me here, it's not the strongest body of evidence. It's one of the more, one of the more challenging bodies of evidence. Because of course, there's huge other differences, say between, a poor African country and a rich Asian country or a rich European country, which also plays a big role in that. There's a huge discrepancy in high school student performance in Africa versus Europe or East Asia. It's a huge discrepancy, or the North, or USA. There's a huge discrepancy. It's partly probably due to these genetic differences, but also certainly, I shouldn't say partly, it is partly due to these genetic differences, but it's also due to big environmental differences. And of course, you also then have this interaction between the two. Like I said, with the parents, the smart parents are talking to their toddlers, okay, and constantly correcting their grammar. So then you say, oh, this smart parent has a child who is very good at words, okay, and has proper grammar. Now you can say, is that genetic or is that environmental? You can see it's kind of a mixture because it's partly the child just got the same brain box from the parents, and it's partly that environmental influence that the parent talked a lot to their child. I'd say the same thing's true of the poor performance of African countries on high school exams. It's partly the genetic component I've talked about in admixture regression, and it's partly the poor environment in those schools.
Yes, Africa has a considerable disease burden. It's pathogen rich. Malaria and the TC fly adversely affect economic growth in
Yes.
Africa, and according to EPIG, cognitive ability limits Africa's human capital potential. But at the same time, human capital advantages are not recent. We know this from the research of Barton. I interviewed him some time ago. East Asians, Europeans, and even Jews had a cognitive advantage before the colonial era. So human capital advantages are not recent. And I would love to see a follow-up study on this topic. Meng Hu, he and John first did a study, but that study focused on America. I'm going to send you a second link for us to continue our conversation because this is going to close soon. But we have to have a part two today. The conversation in part two will become even more interesting. All right. So hold on for the
Okay.
second link.
Okay, will do.